Alright, here is the second quarter of 2022 and all of the books that I read. I have quotes from every book, I have ratings, I have the genre of book. So we're going to get into it and we're going to talk about all the books that I read in the second quarter of 2022. I think the second quarter of 2022 was my smallest amount of reading, so hopefully this won't be too long of a video, but nonetheless, let's get right into it. So the first book that I read in April of 2022 is I Am Malala by Malala Yousafzai. This is a non-fictional autobiographical book written by Malala about her experience speaking out against the Taliban and then getting shot because of that activism. And the quote that I chose from this book is, "When the whole world is silent, even one voice becomes powerful." I rated this book 3 stars. It wasn't my favorite book. I respect so much about what I read in this book and about Malala as a person, but just from my reading experience, it was a 3-star book. The next book that I read was The Deep by Alma Katsu. This is a horror book, and I was really looking forward to this book. I was really hoping it would be terrifying, and it did scare me. I was reading it alone at night, so it did get to me a little bit. It is a mythological or a spooky historical Titanic retelling. So that was very interesting. I enjoyed it, but my rating was 4.25 stars. Not quite as high as I was hoping. I was hoping to find a 5-star read. The quote that I chose from the book is, "Caution humans stay alive longer than incautious ones." I thought that was a funny quote. The next book that I read in 2022 is Mostly Harmless by Douglas Adams. This is the final book in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy series, and I was so happy to be done with this series. By the end, I was not enjoying it. It is a science fiction series, and I rated the final book 2.5 stars. The quote that I chose from the final book is, "A common mistake that people make when trying to design something completely foolproof is to underestimate the ingenuity of complete fools." Next, I read The Convenience Store Woman by Suyaka Murata. This is a contemporary fiction book. It follows the life of a Japanese woman who works in a convenience store, and the quote that I chose from it is, "The normal world has no room for exceptions and always quietly eliminates foreign objects. Anyone who is lacking is disposed of." The next book that I read is 21 Lessons for the 21st Century by Yuval Noah Harari. Having had his previous 2 books make my top 10 list in 2021, I had really high expectations, and maybe that is why I was let down. This book is categorized as a non-fictional book, but I only rated it 3.5 stars. But I do believe that the quote from it is one of the top 10 quotes of 2022 that I've read so far, so at least there's that going for it. The quote that I chose is, "Silence isn't neutrality. It is supporting the status quo." Next book is The Auschwitz Photographer by Luca Crippa. This is a non-fiction book that describes some of the experiences that the author had while being held in a concentration camp and working as a photographer there. It has some incredible pictures in it as well, so that was very interesting to see and to learn about. I rated this book 4.75 stars, and I have a little excerpt. It's not necessarily a quote, it's an excerpt from the book. "He had never seen eyes like this woman's, the eyes of someone alive, but who in a matter of moments would meet their death, the eyes of someone who was watching the doors of hell open in front of them." The next book broke me. The book is Crying in H Mart by Michelle Zauner. This is a memoir that describes a daughter's loss of her mother and really goes into details in her descriptions and experiences with food. But I remember reading this book on a drive out to my sister's house, and when she opened the door to greet me, I had been sobbing, and it just so happened that when I got her out, she was also crying for a different reason, because she caught a mouse in a mouse trap. But it was really funny. She was like, "What's wrong?" And I was like, "A book." So this book really got to me. The quote that I chose is, "The lessons she imparted, the proof of her life lived on in me, in my every move and deed." The next book that I read is The Four Winds by Kristen Hanna. This was my first Kristin Hannah book. There's a lot of hype around the author, a lot of people love her, and a lot of people cry a lot about her books. My sister, a different sister, recommended this one to me. I did enjoy it. I rated it 4.5 stars, and this book is a historical fiction book that follows a woman initially and then her family during the Dust Bowl era and the Depression. It was a very interesting read. I learned a lot that I did not know about at all, and it is very well written. And the audiobook is fantastic. The quote that I chose is, "A warrior believes in an end she can't see and fights for it. A warrior never gives up. A warrior fights for those weaker than herself. That sounds like motherhood to me." And I chose a bonus quote, "Courage is fear you ignore." Moving on to May, the first book that I finished in May is the final book in the Dark Tower series by Stephen King. This is a fantasy series by the king himself. Definitely my favorite series. Definitely one of my favorite series I've ever read. Harry Potter is also up there. It was a 5-star read for me. It destroyed me. The ending was perfection. It was everything I could ever hope for in a book. It was incredible. It was life-changing. I chose 2 quotes from it. The first quote is, "A coward judges all he sees by what he is." I'll read it again. "A coward judges all he sees by what he is." I thought that one was good. It really made me think. And the next quote that I chose is, "A man who can't bear to share his habits is a man who needs to quit them." The next book I read was unfortunately a disappointing one. It is Giving by Bill Clinton. Having read Hillary Clinton's 2 books, I did really enjoy them, and I was hoping that reading her husband's book would also be enjoyable, but for me it wasn't. This is a non-fiction book. I rated it 2.25 stars, and the topic is giving, and he goes through different ways to give, through charities, time, and he tries to impart wisdom and lesson through this book, but it didn't really resonate. The quote that I chose is, "There's a whole world out there that needs you, down the street or across the ocean. Give." That was the best quote I could find. The next book that I read is The Running Man by Stephen King, aka Richard Bachman, or shall I say Richard Bachman, aka Stephen King. This is a dystopian fiction book. I had the lowest expectations having read Rage and what other book had I read? I had read Rage. Just Rage, maybe. Anyway, I didn't have very high expectations, but I rated this book 5 stars. I loved it. It is, I don't remember if I said it, it's a dystopian fiction. The world is maybe 2050 or 2080 or something, and it's really well done. I really enjoyed it. I really loved listening to it. The quote that I chose from it is, "Say your name over 200 times and discover you are no one." The next book that I read definitely made an impression on me. It was one of the most useful books that I've read so far in 2022, and one of the books that I've learned the most from in 2022. The book is Ace by Angela Chen. It is an LGBTQIA+ book. It is a non-fictional book, and I rated it 4.25 stars. I have another excerpt from this book. "Compulsory sexuality is a set of assumptions and behaviors that support the idea that every normal person is sexual, that not wanting socially approved sex is unnatural and wrong, and that people who don't care about sexuality are missing out on an utterly necessary experience." I learned so much from this book. That is just an excerpt. That is a small part. I learned so much just not only about the spectrum of people that exist, but also about language, and I've definitely learned better language and have changed the way I think about some things. The next book that I read is The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab. This is my first Schwab book, but you'll see it is not my last one. It is a fantasy book, and I did enjoy it. I rated it 4 stars, but it's not my favorite of her books that I've read so far. The quote I chose is, "Books, she has found, are a way to live 1,000 lives, or to find strength in a very long one." The next book that I read is another book by Richard Bachman, aka Stephen King. It is categorized as a thriller, and I rated it 1.5 stars. Safe to say I did not enjoy this book, maybe because I did not understand this book. I've seen some reviews by people who believe that this was a very deep book, a very important book. Maybe I'm just not smart enough to see that, but it was not a book that I enjoyed in the slightest. The quote that I chose from it is, "If you feel like shit, everything you see looks like shit." So maybe through that quote, maybe I was in a bad place in my life, and so therefore, through my lens of shit, I view this book as shit, but just wasn't for me. The next book that I read, and oh my gosh, was the timing for this book ever terrible, is The Long Walk by Stephen King as Richard Bachman, another dystopian book. And a lot of people say that this is one of their favorite Stephen King books, and I did really enjoy it, and I do remember it very, very clearly, even though I've read a lot of books since then. But I was reading this book as I was training for my ultra marathon, and I specifically tried listening to it on some of my longest runs. And this book is about a future where multiple boys are selected to walk a race with no ending, where they have to keep up a certain pace, and the last child standing wins. And I felt like I was on the long walk. So it didn't leave positive feelings. It just wasn't great timing-wise for me. I still rated it 4.5 stars because it horrified me. And the quote I chose from it is, "The longer you went without speaking, the harder it gets to break the silence." The next book that I chose to read in 2022 is Let Your Mind Run by Deena Kastor. This is a non-fictional book about an athlete's, I guess you would say an athlete's experiences and her wisdom. However, it was not an enjoyable read for me. I rated this book only 2.5 stars. Here's a quote from it. "Every aspect of a run, from the pain it produces to the weather conditions, offered me a choice. Is this a thought that will slow me down, or can I find a perspective that will speed me up?" The next book that I finished in 2022 is The Perks of Being a Wallflower by Stephen Chbosky. Don't know how to say his last name. I rated this book 4.25 stars. It is categorized as a contemporary fiction. It has been made into a movie that I have not seen. I know that this is some people's favorite books, and I did really enjoy it. The quote that I chose from it is, "We accept the love we think we deserve." On to June. The first book that I read in June, oh my gosh, okay, so here I went off the rails a little bit, away from my usual. We kind of went into the domain of some spicy romances. We went looking for some spicy romance because that's what I felt that I needed at that point in my life. So the first book that I read is After by Anna Todd. This is a romance, and I rated it 3.25 stars. It is one of my coworkers' favorite books. The quote that I chose from it is, "Just because he can't love you the way you want him to doesn't mean he doesn't love you with everything he has." This book is trash, but it did fill something in me that I needed to be filled at that time, as terrible as that sounds. But yeah, this book is definitely trash, and I don't recommend it. But it was my coworker's favorite book, so I couldn't give it the worst rating in the world. The next book that I read is Fear by Bob Woodward. After having read Rage, I thought I would really enjoy more work by the author. However, I only rated this book 2.75 stars. I didn't really enjoy it. It is a non-fictional book that I did learn some pretty interesting things in. However, I don't know, maybe it just wasn't the right time. It's a lot about Donald Trump. And the quote that I chose from it is, "You couldn't talk to him in adult logic. Teenage logic was necessary." The next book that I read is Electra by Jennifer Saint. This is a mythological retelling that I rated 3.75 stars. It's by the same author as Ariadne, and it didn't quite live up to her first book. So I was a little bit disappointed, but it was still a good book. The quote that I chose says, "We would lay down our lives for our children, and every time we faced birth, we stood on the banks of that great river that separated the living from the dead. A massed army of women faced that perilous passage with no armor to protect us, only our own strength and hope that we would prevail." The next book that I read is Vicious by V.E. Schwab. This book I rated 4.5 stars. I enjoyed this book and the next one, Villains, more than I enjoyed the first V.E. Schwab book that I read. This is a fantasy duology. I read the books back to back, so I'll just talk about them both. Vicious I rated 4.5 stars. Villains I rated 4 stars. And I did enjoy this duology a lot. The quote from Vicious is, "Plenty of humans were monstrous, and plenty of monsters knew how to play at being human." And the quote that I chose from Villains is, oh, this is a good quote. "Perhaps she was glass, but glass is only brittle until it breaks. Then it's sharp." The next book that I read, I was really excited about. There is a series named after it on Netflix that I've heard is very, very scary. The book is The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. It is classic horror. It is a classic haunted house trope. So I was really looking forward to reading some scary stuff that wasn't Stephen King, but I was a little bit disappointed. I rated this book only 3 stars. And the quote that I chose from it is, "No live organism can continue for long to exist sanely under conditions of absolute reality." The next book that I read is Finding Me by Viola Davis. This is an autobiography that I rated 4 stars. Not my favorite autobiography, but I do, as a general rule, seem to enjoy female memoirs and autobiographies, so I knew I couldn't really go too terribly wrong by reading it. The quote that I chose from it is, "I knew my life would be a fight, and I realized this. I had it in me." The next book that I read is another spicy romance. Again, just what I was that was just what I was craving around this time. And I'm not sorry to say that I did enjoy it. It is Bare to You by Sylvia Day, that I rated 4.25 stars. It was spicy. And the quote that I chose from it is, "He was the kind of guy that made a woman want to rip his shirt open and watch the buttons scatter along with inhibitions." And the final book that I read in June of 2022 is Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel. This is another dystopian book that, talks about a future where humans live and have colonized the moon. And I rated this book 4.25 stars. It was, I think, my favorite Emily St. John Mandel book because I read all 3 of them in a pretty short amount of time. But the quote that I chose from it is a great place to end off here. The quote is, "Survival is insufficient." Alright, those are the books that I read in the second quarter of 2022. I feel like that took a lot longer than I thought it would to talk about them. I have a lot of books from the third quarter of 2022, and I'm pushing hard to hit my reading goals for this year. It is the middle of November now, but I'm pretty certain that I'm going to prevail, so I'm really excited to tell you more about those. That's all for now. Look forward to the next quarter where I read some more great books.